All right. Welcome to our first virtual Cloud City meetup. We're back in a new pandemic-friendly format. I'm Charles Fitzgerald, and along with Chris Kelly, who's at the Zoom controls, we're your organizers. Chris and I are both technology enthusiasts and also somewhat irreverent angel investors in Seattle. We're coming to you live and direct from Cloud City. That used to mean just Seattle, but in these extraordinary and unprecedented times, we've decoupled from geography, and now the capital city of the cloud is everywhere and anywhere. Our goal is to talk to today's leaders and tomorrow's pioneers who are pushing the technology envelope. The format today is a 45-minute conversation with Eugenio Pace, the co-founder and CEO of Auth0. Then we'll take 15 minutes and let you ask questions. To submit a question, use the Q&A button down there on the bottom of the Zoom screen. So Eugenio, thanks for joining us. Why don't we start, just give us a super short elevator pitch of what Auth0 does so people have some context. And then I'd love to come back and talk about your background and kind of how you got there. And we'll loop back and talk about the company in more depth after that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having me and the opportunity. So Auth0, it's a service for developers that solves two problems: the authentication and the authorization problem of any application. So there's two questions, you can think about it. One is the figuring out whether a user is a legitimate user of a system. And once you figure out that it's a legitimate user, figuring out what they can do. So more like the entitlements. Can I approve an expense report? Can I submit an expense report? Can I read an article? That's what we do. So we give you an API. It's super easy to use, and we abstract your applications from all possible ways of answering those two questions. So log in with your enterprise credentials, or log in with your social network, log in with your face, with your fingers, whatever. Those are different methods to provide an answer. We solve that problem for you.
Perfect. So let's put that aside for a moment and sort of go back and talk about how you got to where you are now. Just walk us through your background and what gets you to today.
So before Auth0, I was at Microsoft. I was there for 13 years. The first 2 years, I was part of the field, of Microsoft fields. I was in consulting, and I was convincing people like my previous version of me before Auth0, before Microsoft, which was I was working in financial services in a bank. And so Microsoft at that time was trying to um, be like a convincing enterprise ready player. This was the time of the first version of the .NET framework, and
I actually
competing.
remember that, but
Yeah,
yes, go on.
so
We overlapped at Microsoft for a while.
you did, yeah. And so I joined there. I worked on the launch of .NET, .NET 1.0, and then subsequent versions. But then a couple years after my field work, I joined Corp. So one of those projects took me here to Redmond, and I joined the Visual Studio team. And so I was doing it more, maybe at more scale, what I was doing specifically one-on-one with our customers. And like when the cloud was becoming a thing, and when Microsoft Azure was not called Azure, it was something else, and you were thinking of,
Windows, Azure, I think.
yeah, when cloud computing at Microsoft was emerging, one of my projects was to identify blockers for adoption for developers, right? So what would prevent a developer from moving applications to the cloud or building applications in the cloud? And guess what? One of the things that we found is that identity management in the pre-cloud world, especially if you live in a Microsoftian utopia, is not a problem actually. It just everything worked. But in a cloud world, and in a non necessarily perfect Microsoftian utopian world, with iPhones and APIs and devices and all these things coexisting, identity management was a big problem. And that was the genesis of Auth0.
So what was the impetus to start? I mean, I can remember you working on this in an architecture team at Microsoft and
Mhm.
interacting with various enterprise customers, but I'm curious what led you to decide to do it as a startup?
Well, technically, Auth0 is my second company. So my first company, I started it and I think calling it a company would be presumptuous, but let's call it a company.
All right.
So I started my first company right out of college, and that did not go very well. I didn't know anything, and to my credit, it was in Argentina, not particularly fertile place for creating companies, and there was no. I mean, this is pre-internet times too, so it was pretty hard. But there was a lot of me to not taking that endeavor to a good place. I always wanted to build something from nothing, right? And so Microsoft was a fantastic experience for me. Like I learned everything about building software at scale, on a global scale. And so I felt like ready. I felt like I turned 42 when I started Auth0. And 42 is the answer for everything, I guess. So
Yeah,
that was
that's
like it was a good
best
time.
the best startup impetus story I've ever heard. I'm curious. I mean, you started out at Microsoft at a time that Microsoft was not the source of very many startups. What gave you the confidence to make the leap? And maybe it was just 42, but I'm also curious, how did Microsoft prepare you? And also, how did Microsoft not prepare you for the startup life?
So look, in life, there's two types of decisions that we have to make. One is the decisions that are easily reversible, and decisions that are not easily reversible, and they're expensive to revert. And I was very happy at Microsoft, but I wasn't completely fulfilled. And so my wife, in her infinite wisdom, told me, "Why don't you just try it? What is the worst that could happen? You're gonna try for some time, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Pretty sure you will find some other job, even in Microsoft. Back at Microsoft. What's the worst that could happen? All your fears are inside your head. In your head, they're not real." And so that's what I did. I just went out and tried for 1 year. I did not raise any money. I didn't know how to do it, by the way. So Microsoft did not give me the classic startup training, like raising money and connecting with investors and pitching, like product market fit, all that stuff. It was not part of my training there. But Microsoft gave me all the tools of, you know, interestingly, remote work.
Hmm.
My team was one of the first teams at Microsoft that did remote work extensively. And so we have teams in India, in Europe, in South America, all over the US, and in Redmond. It wasn't just Redmond. We were on live meeting, we were on Skype, we were on, screen sharing way before it was a thing. It was a written communication. It was email. It was not Slack or chat, but it was like remote work, building a global company too. Like with Microsoft, I visited more than 30 countries all over the planet. And so, like the notion of building a global brand that it was solving a problem, that it was not particularly US centric, I took all of those things with me to Auth0. And we built a global company from day one. Our company today, 60% of our revenues are are in Americas, of which most of it is in the US, and 40% it's outside the US, which is for a company our size. It's a pretty we're kind of like way ahead of others, that tend to be very US centric for a longer period of time. So
And
all of
what do
those,
you attribute that to? Is that you had remote salespeople in more geographies early on, or you had dev people, or what made that work? Because you're definitely ahead of the typical curve of international business.
I think it's the early realization and the acceptance and the embracing the fact that we are, that software pretty much runs the world, literally, and
No
software
argument here.
is everywhere. There's no geography, industry, vertical. The way it doesn't matter how you want to split it. Every company is a software company, and developers are required and needed everywhere. And we thought of ourselves as being a developer platform that there's no constraint. So like everybody needs Auth0. Every developer in the planet needs Auth0. And so sure, we started distributed, maybe out of necessity in the beginning because we couldn't afford to hire people, all in one place. But that was a good thing in retrospect because we hired for talent, and that gives us the local empathy and presence that customers were everywhere. And so from day one, we had people everywhere, all over the
And
planet.
your co-founder was in Argentina from day one and is still there as far as I know.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So
So,
even from day one, I mean, it would have been very hard to do this with a co-founder that I just met, you
right.
know, remote. We knew each other for years. We knew how we worked, and so I think that clearly helped. We got a relationship where like one emoji on Slack or HipChat at that time was enough to
It's
convey
volumes.
an
Yeah.
entire paragraph of sentiments and you know that can only be done when you know somebody really well.
Yep.
But look, even early on, even with some people in Argentina, they were not all in one place. We didn't have an office for year and almost 2 years.
So I mean that pattern of if you've already built the social capital, it's pretty easy to interact remotely. I mean,
Yeah,
you obviously now have hundreds of employees. How have you built the social capital for the organization over time if you've been remote from day one?
yeah, we are 720 people now
Wow.
in 30 countries, I think. And
It's a good sign when you lose track of plus or minus a few.
yeah, we have 7 offices in the world. Um, it's we have a very deliberate onboarding program, and so one of the things that we do it's we train every new employee thoroughly in our ways, and that's of course all the usual things like your values and your mission and all of that, but we also train them in the tooling, in the communications, in what's happening, when, expectation setting. We have like training in like um, when you can use Slack and when you have to stop using Slack and start using Zoom, and then when you should not use any of those and write a document instead. So like all these subtleties of communication, we went like really prescriptive. And so like there's guidelines such as if you find yourself with more than 5 back and forths that are more than 3 sentences on Slack, it's time for you to upgrade to Zoom.
Hmm.
And before the Zoom, it's better to have like a written description of what you're trying to do. We do a lot of offsites, or we used to.
Hmm.
All of that, in forging the relationships that make a company work.
Hmm. Interesting. So what's changed for you since the pandemic? Anything in terms of the way you work?
I mean, before the pandemic, 60% of our company was not associated with an office. So we had offices, but not everybody went to the office every day. Some teams went more often than others, and some teams were more like office bound than others. But in general, we were already pretty well trained. Like minor things like every meeting in Auth0 has a Zoom link. Every meeting. It doesn't matter whether you're all in the same location. We don't think about it. You just every meeting has a Zoom link, even though you might reserve a conference room for your meeting, right? Um, so that didn't change. What has changed is the two things, perhaps. One is that even though we are used to working from home, we are not used to having our kids around all day and no school and pets and cooking 3 meals a day and like that. The personal lives of each one of us is affected, and so we've been paying more attention to how to be flexible and how to be sensitive to the stressors of this overall situation.
Mhm.
The second one is, we are rethinking the role of our offices as well. So we're not going to eliminate offices. I think, one day we're not going to be in the same situation. We're going to go back to be able to have meetings face to face with less, concern that we have today. But we're thinking about what would be the purpose of having an office. We always thought about the office as being embassies of Auth0 around the world. So the model of, here's a place where you can collaborate, where we can do community outreach, where we can connect with customers, with partners, with employees. We do offsites in offices. And so in a way, we are kind of expanding the office, like making it like doubling down on that concept of
Right.
the
As
office as
opposed
a
to
service.
a desk to go sit at. Interesting. Well, sounds like you've probably had an easier time with the pandemic transition than a lot of companies. Why don't we talk about the identity market broadly? It'd be
Yeah,
interesting to hear how you think about it, the different segments, and then your approach. I mean, one of the things that's been interesting, you were also early on the developer first approach. So I'd love to talk about the market broadly, and then a little bit on kind of how we think about it, the developer as the decision maker and the driver in this space.
yeah. So maybe on the first piece, the market, the way identity management has been traditionally split, and even more so in the last maybe year or so, it's on workforce identity and customer identity. So workforce identity, it's the main difference is who is the user that you're authenticating. And so in workforce is an employee. So you're thinking about your own employees. So in my case, I log in into Zoom, I log in into Google Docs or into Slack or into Expensify, systems that I use for productivity. And so I want single sign-on across all of those. I don't want to enter a Zoom password and an Expensify password. I enter an Auth0 credential and I get single sign-on across all of those systems. Related to that, there's of course the concern of governance. Am I supposed to be able to read this document in GDocs, or can I approve this expense report? Can I approve this payment or whatever? I'm in engineering. I can do things in Amazon, like those kind of things. The customer identity and access management world, it's when the user is not your employee, but it's typically somebody else, right? We have a specific view, which is a little bit more nuanced, meaning that we kind of split the customer identity management in two. One is the consumer identity, which is like the classic example is, you go to Amazon.com and you buy stuff. You buy as a consumer, as an individual. I'm Eugenio at gmail.com, logging into Amazon to buy stuff, or logging into the Seattle Times and be, accessing the content in Seattle Times. That's a consumer space. The other space is what we call business to business, which is really when the user is the other side of the coin of workforce. It's still customer, but it's not a consumer. So if you are, let's say you are Zoom, you have to have infrastructure on your side to be able to accept a company's identity from somebody to log you into Zoom, right? So software companies are the perfect example of B2B, although there's other examples. So if you're...
It's gotten a lot more complex. I mean, you used to have all your apps
Um,
nicely inside your firewall. Now you have hundreds, if not thousands, of SaaS apps.
Yes. So those three categories, consumer identity, business to business identity, which is not users that you own. I mean, they're your customers, whether it's a business or a consumer. And workforce identity are like the three big worlds of identity and access management. Our opinion is that, yes, there are subtleties in one and the other. I would argue that customer identity and consumer identity in particular, it's pretty hard. If you think about it, the volume, like in different dimensions, the complexity is pretty high. So in consumer identity, you can have millions of users for one single application, right? So I don't know how many users are or subscribers Seattle Times has, but I bet it's hundreds of thousands or millions of users. There are not many businesses with 1 million employees, right? So in scale, one is like completely in a different world, just by sheer numbers. The other thing that makes it different is that the threat and these properties are subject to very specific type of attacks that are increasingly more complicated to deal with. An example of that is credential stuffing attacks, where now, cloud computing is great. It works for good or for bad. Launching a distributed, geo-distributed, massive, brute force password cracking attack on systems today, it's pretty easy and pretty cheap too. And protecting against that, it's pretty hard, which is one of the things that we do. So those are attacks that are more prevalent in the CIM space than in others.
CIM is the consumer side.
Yeah. But with that nuance, we believe that at the end of the day, it's the same thing, right? So you're like saying, are you a user, yes or no? Or maybe yes and no with some tones of gray in between, right? So it's not necessarily black and white, the authentication.
Right, because you can look at multiple signals. You could say, hey, the IP address is coming from the Ukraine, so, we've never seen that before. Maybe we should be a little suspicious.
Right. So one like you see this in Amazon it's very obvious there. So you log into Amazon, and if you leave your browser open for days on your computer, it still recognizes you, right? So it will say, oh, you bought a welder, here's a wrench or whatever. Like recommendations are driven by
There's another welder, usually
another
recommendation, but yeah.
So personalization and recommendation engines rely on returning users. And so they need to know who you are. That's a low risk transaction though, browsing the catalog. But whenever you want to check out, sometimes they will ask for your password again. That's a perfect example of this, kind of gray continuous authentication experience that you see in some more advanced consumer properties. But what I was saying before is like, at the end of the day, there's some of these building blocks that are common to all use cases. So the actual login, it's common. The multi-factor authentication challenge, it's common. It can be used for employees or consumers. When you do it, or the conditions or the type of MFA might change in one or the other. But the fact that you're going to be challenged with many factors is not, it's a generic thing. So our approach, it's more like a platform or general purpose, backplane of services that developers can then take and say, okay, for my use case, I need, login, and I actually need social network login too. And for some transactions, I'm going to require MFA. So I'm going to bring the MFA box. And as a developer, I want to be able to kind of wire all that up for an experience that is going to be great for my users.
Right. I mean, it's kind of the classic developer business. You look for something that lots of people have to implement over and over again. And, if you can provide that, that's a very leveraged piece of code.
Exactly.
So you were also very early in targeting a developer first SaaS business. And I'm interested in both how that plays on the identity side, and then we can also kind of talk about what it means for go to market. But historically, at least on those workplace identities, we've had big centralized identity systems, directories. People went and sold those things to centralized IT. Tell us how the developer led motion works across those different segments.
So in identity management, most people were used to, oh, this is going to be 9 months project and difficult and complicated, and there's going to be these migrations like you need to do and bulk, and it's not uncommon to see these lengthy, complicated um, deployments. When we started Auth0, it was the emergence of the Twilios of the world. There were three companies, four companies that we looked up to. One was Stripe. The second one was Twilio. The third one was SendGrid, and the fourth one was Heroku. And so we say, like, look at Stripe. Stripe, if you want to take payments on your website without Stripe, where do you start? If I'm a developer, like working on a side project on a weekend, do I call who? Bank of America or Visa or they will not take my call.
Yeah.
I'm a single, it's not going to work, right? Unless you're a big corporation, you have no access to those platforms. Stripe, however, made that a non-problem. It doesn't matter if you want to take Visa or MasterCard or Amex. I just use the same 2 lines of code. 2 lines of code, any developer in the planet can add those 2 lines of code in the JavaScript or in the HTML or whatever, and the problem is solved. Twilio did the same thing. I don't need to deal with Verizon and AT&T and
Mhm.
Telstra and Vodafone. With the same 2 lines of code, I can send an SMS anywhere in the world. That was the inspiration for us, because we said, like, why is identity that complicated? And something I didn't mention, but as part of my work at Microsoft, I wrote with a team, my team, we wrote 2 books on identity management. And every book was getting bigger and more complicated. And it was like, why is this an issue? Why cannot be like 2 lines of code that the problem is solved and you can move on? And so we started with that in mind. We say, like, we're going to make this these projects not 9 months, for God's sake. It's going to be 30 minutes. Like, that's the goal. It's like removing months, giving you back 9 months of your life so you can do other things that are more important.
Yeah, it's
And so,
interesting because both Stripe and Twilio have put a developer-friendly veneer on top of, either payment rails or the telco networks. You're not even putting a veneer on top of anything, right? I mean, you've actually kind of owned the underlying substrate, the systems that whether they're doing MFA or biometrics or whatever it may be. So you control your destiny in some ways a little bit more than those other companies.
that's true. We do that, although we also abstract other systems downstream. So when we also started the company, we did not expect everybody to just move everything to us, because that would be a big bet, right? And so we say, like, oh, you want to log in with Google? Sure, we can do that. But first you call us, and then we will do like the Twilio model,
Right.
rely on
You're a
some.
you're a one-stop shop, programmer
For
friendly, and whatever you want to work with, you'll wire it up. So walk us through those three different markets: consumer, B2B, the workplace. Some of those seem more developer centric than others.
Yeah,
The
they do.
developers are the new kingmakers line is apt for a couple of those, and I should do my Steve Ballmer imitation of developers, developers, developers. Now I've got that out of the way. So
Yes. So certainly the non-work. I mean, workforce is a little bit tricky because within workforce there's two worlds. There's the world of commodity productivity apps, right? So which company on the planet is going to build their own video conferencing platform? Not many, right?
couple,
A couple, but not many.
right?
But there's the whole world of line of business applications. Those are applications being built for your own company, for your own employees, but you cannot source them from anywhere because those are like your own things, right? So that and everything customer is very much developer influenced because people
For
tend to
sure. Right.
invest in there. So no surprise, if you look at our business and the revenue, the pie chart over the type of projects that we're typically used, 90% it's customer and 10% it's workforce today.
Right.
Right? That doesn't mean that it's going to change in the future, but
But we've seen in
today,
that pattern of centralized infrastructure, kind of top down, IT centric stuff, winning in the short term, but then the developer centric model winning over the long term. So I'm curious sort of how you see that workplace
yeah.
side evolving.
And I think that's true. I think there is a value eventually in like having like one platform to do everything, which is certainly our aspiration. But there's so much space. The market is one thing I should mention too is that it might seem that this is a solved problem, but it isn't, and it's a massive, massive market. Like
Yeah, I mean, it
the
seems like there are all kinds of interesting new frontier topics, whether it's biometrics or sign in with Apple or passwordless or anything else. I mean, where do you see things going over the next couple of years?
So I think there's certainly two big trends that drive growth for us. One is the sophistication of the attacks and the threats that we see in the market. So that's not decreasing; it is increasing, and we are in a unique position because the traffic that goes to we see everything. And so, in a way, we are able to correlate events outside the boundary of one specific company. And that's very difficult to replicate, if you're on your own.
Sure.
If you're at Seattle Times, and if you're, I don't know, some other company, You don't see each other's, the Wall Street Journal, you don't see each other's traffic. You see only your traffic. Whereas we can start to see abnormal behavior that transcends one specific application. And that gives us, it's there's some network effect there because the more traffic, the more valuable, the more better protection, then it makes us more attractive. So it's a virtuous circle there. Um, so threats, it's a never-ending battle, right? So you're never done in security. In security, you're always fighting another battle and bringing addressing new challenges. There's another component which is innovation. What you said, like there's something new happening all the time. There's login with Apple, which Apple kind of dumped on the market last year without a lot of
Not a lot of advance notice
not
there.
a lot of heads up as usual. And guess what? They don't know. Not only is it's an interesting, valuable feature, but they also made it mandatory for some types of applications. And so now you're a developer, and it's like, oh wow, I need to like implement this thing. And of course, they implemented a standard, OpenID Connect, but it's a standard with applesauce. And so it's not quite the standard. It's almost the standard, but with some nuance here and there. So the implementation is not that trivial. And what happens is that then now you need to distract usually like strong, skilled resources on something that is not really your thing. And with us, because we do that, that's what we do. All you need to do is turn on the switch and say, I just want Apple ID as another mechanism for logging in, and it's taken care of. So I think
Yeah,
that's it.
classic platform business. You implement it once and then can share that fruits of that work with everybody else. And let's talk about the other side of developers, which is how do you actually reach them? Developers notoriously don't like to be marketed to, they don't like to be sold to. So I'd be interested in, how do you think about reaching them as customers, and how has that evolved from the days when you were a teeny little startup to a much bigger company today?
So you're absolutely right. Developers don't like to be sold. They don't like to buy. They don't like to talk to anybody. They're like a quirky, category. And I say I'm a developer too, so I'm quirky too. Every time I'm trying a new product, I don't want to talk to anybody. No chat, no call to sales, none of that. I just want to be able to try things and tinker on my own, to oversimplify things. And so I want to be able to go to the website, read what is it about, click a button, get the thing. I want to be guided into my own context. So I'm a Node.js or a .NET developer. I want to be the experience to be tailored to who I am. And then I want to, short attention span, quick to the solution, quick time to instant gratification in a way. And so if you look at our go to market is optimized for that from day one, really. And so you go, you find us. There's a lot of content. There's our marketing. It's primarily content marketing. So you
Mhm.
find training, tutorials, quick starts, SDKs on every single framework on the world. There's all these, like I'm showing you the problem and I'm showing you that Auth0 solves the problem, but you don't have to necessarily use Auth0 to learn about the problem either. And so it's this subtle equilibrium. You get a free account, it's free forever on a limited use. There's some restrictions, but you can for like hobby projects, you can use it forever free. There's a generous free trial too, so you can try out everything for a generous period of time. And then you can upgrade to a self-service paying account. So if there's something that you want that it's premium, you can just put the credit card using Stripe, and you get a paid account with those extra features. But if you happen to be a company and say, well, I'm a developer, I say we should be using this, but the CISO approves, or the security team needs to bless the solution, then that's when you call sales. And that's when you say, I need to know if you're compliant. I need to know if you are, SOC 2 compliant. And what about your jurisdictional data protections and blah, 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 all that stuff. That's so in a way, we're not like Twilio actually, or SendGrid in our go-to market entirely, because most of their business, I would say, is in the category of self-service. It's the credit card pay as you go, and they built their enterprise sales motions later on. We are a hybrid in between. So we're not like pure enterprise sales, and we're not purely self-service. We have a little bit of both, especially in the what we call enterprise deals, right? Any deal that it's 1 year contract or multi-year contracts with security requirements.
Right.
That's
When the CISO gets involved, the CIO gets involved.
correct.
So, I mean, obviously you're selling more to the enterprise now, but are there other things that have changed over your, I mean, you guys have been going for pushing a decade now, things that have changed over how you interact with developers?
Not on that. I mean, it's staying true to developers requires investment. It's not like something, oh, I want to be a developer company. We just put a blog, a community site, and some Twitter with SDKs. That doesn't work. It needs to be genuine investment. And so if you look at our, we have teams that are dedicated to maintaining good quality, up to date content, training that fuels that, right? So it's like security, it's a never ending thing. There's always something new. There's new APIs, there's new products. It's keeping an eye on the trends. What's hip today? What's the new stack? How do we support the old stack too? Maintaining the quality of things over time. So, um, we improved our startup plans, we improved our pricing, and to make it like smoother around. So that's a never ending thing, and we continue to do that. What has changed is our expansion. So maybe this is more for other companies considering this. We have a great landing story because developers find us, they take us, they change jobs, they switch jobs and say, oh, we use Auth0 there, we should use Auth0 here. So it's kind of like viral
Right.
spread across the world. But expansion, we figured that that's organic and great, but that is not, can be faster, and you can grow faster by investing in expansion. So early on, we invested also in expansion. Today, I would say, whereas 3 years ago, 90% of the opportunities were inbound opportunities. So people who would click on the call, talk to sales button and create an inbound opportunity. I would say now it's 50-50. So we still have a robust inbound um, opportunity generation, but we also look for opportunities ourselves, because we are on these all these companies and we say, hey, did you know that you're using us here and there and some other place, and why don't you just
Yeah, that's a pattern we've definitely seen before in different places. So I won't ask if you have a Haskell library for your service. One more question from me, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Is there specific advice you'd give somebody who wants to build the next great technology company in Seattle?
Well, Seattle, first of all, it's a great place to start a company. and it's getting better and better. There's great talent, even though, of course, there's competition for talent. But as a startup, you can bring a lot of attractive things that are very difficult to replicate for bigger companies, which is like the growth, the excitement, the like conquer the world mindset that other companies will have a harder time replicating. So it's a great time. But I would say these days you're not constrained to Seattle, right? So there's great talent and advice and even funding more and more, maybe more so than used to be. Certainly when we started, when we have like fewer options, but it's a great place. But you don't have to be limited by just thinking, oh, it has to be Seattle for sure.
Argentina's time has come. All right.
Yeah.
Let's take some questions from the audience. So question, as a founder who serves other founders, you have a unique insight on what technology companies, perhaps your clients, you find interesting. Thoughts on interesting companies coming up next year? It may be interesting also just to add that to, what are the technologies you're seeing on the kind of the periphery of your world?
Yeah, let's see. I think there's a lot of interest from companies in staying, at least certainly happens in our world. It's the how can we make our offering somewhat cloud agnostic, right? So there's a number of technologies that are relevant in that space, where like containers or Kubernetes or like all that stuff, that I think there's value, because as you grow and you become bigger, there's clearly segments of customers that won't do business with some of the big cloud providers, right? Whether it's Amazon or Microsoft, for whatever reason, whether it's jurisdictional, like I'm in this particular country, that there's only Microsoft, or there's only Amazon, or I'm a company that compete with Amazon. I don't want to. I want to give Amazon any money, even if it's through you. Like
Right.
even if it's you, I'm not giving it directly. So that's something that we deal with quite a
So
bit.
do you have a hybrid on-prem
We do not
solution?
on-prem anymore. We used to, but we don't do on-prem anymore. But we do have like multi-cloud offerings.
Okay. So you mentioned containers. Are you also getting into access management? And the specific question is, does Auth0 address other types of access management like infrastructure machines, third-party apps? How much access am I giving to GitHub, Slack? So developer entitlement type things.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a whole world of fine-grained authorization, which is being like somewhat elusive, to like generalize. There's been some attempts in the past to like provide like an engine of a generic engine for fine-grained authorization. So if you think about access to GitHub repos or the Google Docs model, where you have like you can edit, you can comment, you can view, and you have groups and people. It's like a very complicated graph of permissions that need to be resolved at any point in time. They can be revoked, it can be granted. If you think about like the expense management, can you up to $1,000 auto approve, over $1,000 two signatures, like more like business oriented access control? That's certainly an area of interest for us.
You could integrate with something like Terraform or whatever, but it's a
It-
lot of configuration work on the part of the customer because you are implementing business processes. So another question, I've been at the Internet Identity Workshop this week, lots of momentum on self-sovereign identity. What's your outlook, comments on decentralization, SSI for identification, and W3C verifiable credentials as the basis for authorization capabilities?
Well, you need to talk to an expert in that, in all of that, which is not me anymore.
Okay, well,
So I would say that, look, decentralization or decentralized ID, it's exciting, and it reminds me in a way of some, Charles, you might remember this. You might remember card space
yep.
in the Microsoft world, where this notion that you would
The laws of
from
identity.
the laws of identity. So, some things get recycled and reinvented, and look, I don't think it makes us necessarily irrelevant, if that's a question. On the contrary, I think it helps when we can make you can help you make the leap, easier, and the transition easier. I still think it's somewhat early for that in particular. What I do
Definitely.
see, what I do see though, it's a much more maybe mundane and but more compelling requirement, which is around privacy and control for what kind of information are systems retaining about users, and how is the control being sent back to the users, right? And so I think companies are more aware that they want to be leaders and be perceived as being ahead of the curve, and say, yes, we have your date of birth, your address, and your name and email. Here's how we are using this, and you can revoke or consent access to what. The power is on you. That we certainly see quite a bit growing more and more
Yeah,
over
I'm
time.
sure those regulatory requirements on the privacy front, whether they deliver any privacy or not, are a boon for the business. Another question, what's the one thing you wish you had done earlier to increase developer community engagement when you were just starting?
Um, One thing that we did and then we stopped, we kind of we were spread too thin initially. You know, what is it saying? Hindsight is 2020. So
Mhm.
sure, I one thing it was a mistake is that we spread out like every framework, every technology platform, anything. We had like a presence. I wrote an SDK for classic ASP, if you remember that thing.
But did you do Haskell is the question I would ask.
I didn't do it,
Didn't
but
didn't go
we
that
have
far.
Haskell.
That's good.
So very early on, we kind of like we had an SDK for everything. And then the quality suffered because we couldn't keep up with every possible version combination. And so you have like WordPress 401 running on
Right. The
PHP
combinatorics are a nightmare.
explosion. So I think in retrospect, it would have been better to maybe like be more deliberate and say, like, we're gonna focus on these 5, 10 core ones, and then not prevent others from doing other things, but high quality on these five. And so quality suffered a little bit in between. We fixed it by being focused and setting expectations, but it's
And
very
that
humbling.
focus was 80% of the market. It was 50% of the market. How did you decide how to dial it back?
Yeah, we set expectations, so we got better at defining what are the things that we are going to do, and we are going to put a stamp on it, and that's feedback or use and metrics and demand, and just listening to customers. I don't know if Haskell made it to that list.
Yeah, Haskell's always just below that cutoff line. There's a question here that's pretty pointed in terms of specific vendors, but I'd be interested to hear your take on, for the workplace identity scenario, why the developer-centric approach is better than a traditional IT approach. So how do you pitch for that workplace business?
No, I don't think it's better. I think IT typically wants, the black box that does the job, and they don't want to code anything. So there's no developer play in there. And there's great solutions, frankly, out there. There's, Okta, there's Microsoft, there's OneLogin, there's a whole bunch of others, but I mentioned that maybe the three most important ones. If you want is, I just want to configure Salesforce and 50 other SaaS applications connected with my Active Directory,
Yeah.
and I
So
just want it to
if it's
work.
just single sign-on, those are
Those apps,
will get it
those
done.
solutions work great. They're great companies, all of them. I have good relationships. Our product interoperates very well with those platforms as well. What I
Mhm.
would say though is that it's always easier to specialize something generic than generalize something that is specific. And so my longer term bet is that eventually, we can, workforce is just one instantiation of a general purpose platform.
Right. And as
That,
that platform gets built up, as it gets scale, as it gets functionality, I mean, that's what we've seen historically, where it's sort of tortoise and hare kind of race. All right, there's one more question about more Steve Ballmer impersonations. When we add a monologue to the beginning of the meetup, we'll consider that, but not today. With that, we wanted to end on time, so I think we're gonna wrap up. And I really want to thank Eugenio for joining us. Couple of logistical items. One, please go to feedback.cloudcitymeetup.com right now and let us know what you think. We're really trying to figure out how we can make this format work successfully. So thoughts on timing, topics, et cetera, would all be very welcome. Number two, we should have a recording up on cloudcitymeetup.com in the next day or two. So if you want to hear any of my bad jokes or send it on to other people, please do that. And then lastly, our next installment is November 11th, where we'll be talking with Diego Oppenheimer from Algorithmia. He's got a very good sense of what's happening on the ground in the enterprise with machine learning. And we're also going to make some jokes about TikTok probably. So thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at the next episode.
Thanks, everybody.
thank you.